"I also will meet him," said Renault Vidal, rising suddenly from the stone which he occupied. "Follow me, then," mumbled the priest. "The Flemings know me, and will let me forward." But Father Aldrevan being in disgrace, his influence was not so potent as he had flattered himself, and both he and the minstrel were jostled to and fro in the crowd and separated from each other. Vidal, however, was recognized by the English peasants who had before spoke to him. "Canst thou do any juggler's feats, minstrel?" said one. "Thou mayst earn a fair largesse, for our Norman masters love jonglery." "I know but one," said Vidal, "and I will show it if you will yield me some room." They crowded a little off from him, and gave him time to throw aside his unit, bare his legs and knees by stripping off the leathern buskins, which swathed them, and retaining only his sandals. He then tied a party-colored handkerchief around his swarthy and sunburnt hair, and casting off his upper doublet, showed his brawny and nervous arms naked to the shoulder. But while he amused those immediately about him with these preparations, a commotion and rush among the crowd together, with the close sound of trumpets, answered by all the Flemish instruments of music, as well as the shouts in Norman and English of "Long live the gallant constable, our lady," for the bold de Lacy, announced that the constable was close at hand. Vidal made incredible exertions to approach the leader of the procession, whose morion, distinguished by its lofty plumes and right hand holding his truncheon or leading staff, was all he could see on account of the crowd of officers and armed men around him. At length his exertions prevailed, and he came within 3 yards of the constable, who was then in a small circle, which had been with difficulty kept clear for the purpose of the ceremonial of the day. His back was towards the minstrel, and he was in the act of bending from his horse to deliver the royal charter to Wilkin Flammock, who had knelt on one knee to receive it. The more reverentially his discharge of this duty occasioned the constable to stoop so low that his plumes seemed in the act of mixing with the flowing mane of his noble charger. At this moment Vidal threw himself with singular agility over the heads of the Flemings who guarded the circle, and ere an eye could twinkle his right knee was on the croup of the constable's horsed grasp of his left hand on the collar of de Lacy's buff coat. Then, clinging to its prey like a tiger after its leap, he drew in the same instant of time a short sharp dagger and buried it in the back of the neck, just where the spine, which was severed by the stroke, serves to convey to the trunk of the human body the mysterious influences of the brain. The blow was struck with the utmost accuracy of aim and strength of arm. The unhappy horseman dropped from his saddle without groan or struggle, like a bull in the amphitheater under the steel of the toreador, and in the same saddle sat his murderer, brandishing the bloody poniard and urging the horse to speed. There was indeed a possibility of his having achieved his escape, so much were those around paralyzed for the moment by the suddenness and audacity of the enterprise. But Flammock's presence of mind did not forsake him. He seized the horse by the bridle, and aided by those who wanted but an example, made the rider prisoner, bound his arms, and called aloud that he must be carried before King Henry. This proposal, uttered in Flammock's strong and decided tone of voice, silenced 1,000 wild cries of murder and treason which had arisen, while the different and hostile natives, of which the crowd was composed, threw upon each other reciprocally the charge of treachery. All the streams, however, now assembled in one channel, and poured with unanimous assent towards the Gare de la Rousse, excepting a few of the murdered nobleman's train, who remained to transport their master's body in decent solemnity of mourning from the spot which he had sought with so much pomp and triumph. When Flammock reached the Gare de la Rousse, he was readily admitted with his prisoner, and with such witnesses as he had selected to prove the execution of the crime. To his request of an audience, he was answered that the king had commanded that none should be admitted to him for some time, yet so singular were the tidings of the constable's slaughter that the captain of the guard ventured to interrupt Henry's privacy in order to communicate that event, and returned with orders that Flammock and his prisoner should be instantly admitted to the royal apartment. Here they found Henry, attended by several persons, who stood respectfully behind the royal seat in a darkened part of the room. When Flammock entered, his large bulk and massive limbs were strangely contrasted, with cheeks pale with horror at what he had just witnessed, and with awe at finding himself in the royal presence chamber, Beside him stood his prisoner, undaunted by the situation in which he was placed. The blood of his victim, which had spirted from the wound, was visible on his bare limbs, and his scanty garments, but particularly upon his brow and the handkerchief with which it was bound. Henry gazed on him with a stern look, which the other not only endured without dismay, but seemed to return with a frown of defiance. "Does no one know this caitiff?" said Henry, looking around him. There was no immediate answer, until Philip Garin, stepping from the group, which stood behind the royal chair, said, though with hesitation, "So please you, my liege. But for the strange guise in which he is now arrayed, I should say, there was a household minstrel of my master by name Renault Vidal." "Thou art deceived, Norman," replied the minstrel. "My menial place and base lineage were but assumed. I am Cadwallon, the Briton Cadwallon of the Nine, lays Cadwallon, the chief bard of Gwenwyn of Powisland and his avenger." As he uttered the last word, his looks encountered those of a palmer, who had gradually advanced from the recess in which the attendants were stationed, and now confronted him. The Welshman's eyes looked eagerly ghastly, as if flying from their sockets, while he exclaimed in a tone of surprise, mingled with horror, "Do the dead come before monarchs, or, if thou art alive, whom have I slain? I dreamed not surely of that bound. And of that homeblow it, my victim stands before me. Have I not slain the constable of Chester?" "Thou hast indeed slain the constable," answered the king, "but no Welshman. It was Randall de Lacy, on whom that charge was this morning conferred by our belief of our loyal and faithful Hugh de Lacy's having been lost upon his return from the Holy Land, as the vessel in which he had taken passage was reported to have suffered shipwreck. Thou hast cut short Randall's brief elevation, but by a few hours, for tomorrow's sun would have again seen him without land or lord." The prisoner dropped his head on his bosom in evident despair. "I thought," he murmured, "that he had changed his slough and come forth so glorious. All too soon may the eyes drop out that were cheated with those baubles, a plumed cap, and a lacquered baton." "I will take care, Welshman, thine eyes cheat thee not again," said the king sternly. "Before the night is an hour older, they shall be closed on all that is earthly." "May I request of your nobleness," said the constable, "that you will permit me to ask the unhappy man a few questions?" "When I have demanded of him myself," said the king, "why he has dipped his hands in the blood of a noble Norman." "Because he at whom I aimed my blow," said the Briton, his eye glancing fiercely from the king to de Lacy and back, "had spilled the blood of the descendant of 1,000 kings, to which his own gore, or thine proud Count of Anjou, is but as the puddle of the highway to the silver fountain." Henry's eye menaced the audacious speaker, but the king reigned in his wrath when he beheld the imploring look of his servant. "What wouldst thou ask of him?" he said. "Be brief, for his time is short." "So please you, my liege, I would but demand wherefore he has for years forborne to take the life he aimed at when it was in his power, nay, when it must have been lost, but for his seemingly faithful service." "Norman," said Cadwallon, "I will answer thee. When I first took upon me thy service, it was well my purpose to have slain thee that night. There stands the man," pointing to Philip Garin, "to whose vigilance thou owedst thy safety." "Indeed," said de Lacy, "I do remember some indications of such a purpose, but why didst thou forego it, when following opportunities put it in thy power?" "When the slayer of my sovereign became God's soldier," answered Cadwallon, "and served his cause in Palestine, he was safe from my earthly vengeance." "A wonderful forbearance on the part of a Welsh assassin," said the king scornfully. "I," answered Cadwallon, "and which certain Christian princes have scarce attained to, who have never neglected the chance of pillage or conquest afforded by the absence of a rival in the Holy Crusade." "Now by the Holy Rood," said Henry, on the point of bursting out, for the insult affected him peculiarly, but suddenly stopping, he said, with an air of contempt, "To the gallows with the knave." "But one other question," said de Lacy. "Renault, or by whatever name thou art called, ever since my return thou hast rendered me service inconsistent with thy stern resolution upon my life. Thou didst aid me in my shipwreck hand, didst guide me safely through Wales, where my name would have ensured my death, and all this after the crusade was accomplished." "I could explain thy doubts," said the bard, "but that it might be thought I was pleading for my life." Hesitate, riot, for that said the king, for were our holy father to intercede, for thee his prayer were in vain. Well then, said the bard, know the truth, I was too proud to permit either Wave or Welshman to share in my revenge. Know also what is perhaps Cadwalladen's weaknesses, and habit had divided my feelings towards de Lacy. Between aversion and admiration, I still contemplated my revenge, but as something which I might never complete, and which seemed rather an image in the clouds than an object to which I must one day draw near. And when I beheld thee, he said, turning to de Lacy, this very day so determined, so sternly resolved to bear thy impending fate like a man, that you seem to me to resemble the last tower of a ruined palace, still holding its head to heaven, when its walls of splendor and its bowers of delight lay in desolation. Around me I perish, I said to myself in secret ere I perfect its ruin. Yes, de Lacy, then even then but some hours since hadst thou accepted my proffered hand, I had served thee as never follower served master. You rejected it with scorn, and yet notwithstanding that insult it required that I should have seen you, as I thought, trampling over the field in which you slew my master, in the full pride of Norman insolence, to animate my resolution to strike the blow, which meant for you has slain at least one of your usurping race. I will answer no more questions. Lead on to axe or gallows. It is indifferent to Cadwal. Me soul will soon be with my free and noble ancestry, and with my beloved and royal patron. My liege and prince, said de Lacy, bending his knee to Henry, can you hear this, and refuse your ancient servant one request? Spare this man, extinguish not such a light, because it is devious and wild. Rise, rise, de Lacy, and shame thee of thy petition, said the king. Thy kinsman's blood, the blood of a noble Norman, is on the Welshman's hands and brow. As I am crowned king, he shall die ere it is wiped off. Here, have him to present execution. Cadwallon was instantly withdrawn under a guard. The constable seemed by action, rather than words, to continue his intercession. Thou art mad, de Lacy, thou art mad, mine old and true friend, to urge me thus, said the king, compelling de Lacy to rise. Seest thou not that my care in this matter is for thee? This Randall, by largesses and promises, hath made many friends, who will not perhaps easily again be brought to your allegiance, returning, as thou dost, diminished in power and wealth. Had he lived, we might have had hard work to deprive him entirely of the power which he had acquired. We thank the Welsh assassin who hath rid us of him, but his adherents would cry foul play. Were the murderer spared, when blood is paid for blood, all will be forgotten, and their loyalty will once more flow in its proper channel to thee, their lawful lord. Hugo de Lacy arose from his knees and endeavored respectfully to combat the politic reasons of his wily sovereign, which he plainly saw were resorted to less for his sake than with the prudent purpose of effecting the change of feudal authority with the least possible trouble to the country or sovereign. Henry listened to de Lacy's arguments patiently and combated them with temper until the death drum began to beat and the castle bell to toll. He then led de Lacy to the window, on which, for it was now dark, a strong ruddy light began to gleam from without. A body of men-at-arms, each holding in his hand a blazing torch, were returning along the terrace from the execution of the wild but high-souled Briton, with cries of "Long live King Henry, and so perish all enemies of the gentle Norman men." Conclusion. A sun hath set, a star hath risen. O Geraldine, since arms of thine have been the lovely lady's prison. Coleridge. Popular fame had erred in assigning to Evelyn Beringer, after the capture of her castle, any confinement more severe than that of her aunt, the Lady Abbess of the Cistercians convent, afforded, yet that was severe enough, for maiden aunts, whether abbesses or no, are not tolerant of the species of errors of which Evelyn was accused, and the innocent damoiselle was brought in many ways to eat her bread in shame of countenance and bitterness of heart. Every day of her confinement was rendered less and less endurable by taunts in the various forms of sympathy, consolation, and exhortation, but which, stripped of their assumed forms, were undisguised anger and insult. The company of Rose was all which Evelyn had to sustain her under these inflictions, and that was at length withdrawn on the very morning when so many important events took place at the Gare d'Ollerusse. The unfortunate young lady inquired in vain of a grim-faced nun who appeared in Rose's place to assist her to dress while her companion and friend was debarred attendance. The nun observed on that score an obstinate silence, but threw out many hints on the importance attached to the vain ornaments of a frail child of clay, and on the hardship that even a spouse of heaven was compelled to divert her thoughts from her higher duties and condescend to fasten clasps and adjust veils. The lady abbess, however, told her niece after matins that her attendant had not been withdrawn from her for a space only, but was likely to be shut up in a house of the severest profession, for having afforded her mistress assistance in receiving Damien de Lacy into her sleeping apartment at the castle of Baldringham. A soldier of de Lacy's band who had hitherto kept what he had observed a secret, being off his post, that night had now in Damien's disgrace found he might benefit himself by telling the story, this new blow so unexpected, so afflictive his new charge, which it was so difficult to explain, and so impossible utterly to deny, seemed to Eveline to seal Damien's fate, and her own, while the thought that she had involved in ruin her single-hearted and high-souled attendant was all that had been wanting to produce a state which approached to the apathy of despair. Think of me, what you will, she said to her aunt. I will no longer defend myself, say, what you will I will no longer reply, carry me, where you will I will no longer resist. God will, in his good time, clear my fame, may he forgive my persecutors. After this, and during several hours of that unhappy day, the Lady Eveline, pale, cold, silent, glided from chapel to refectory, from refectory to chapel again, at the slightest beck of the abbess or her official sisters, and seemed to regard the various privations, penances, admonitions, and reproaches of which she in the course of that day was subjected to an extraordinary share, no more than a marble statue minds the inclemency of the external air or the raindrops which fall upon it, though they must in time waste and consume it. The abbess, who loved her niece, although her affection showed itself often in a vexatious manner, became at length alarmed, countermanded her orders for removing Eveline to an inferior cell, attended herself to see her laid in bed, in which, as in everything else, the young lady seemed entirely passive, and with something like reviving tenderness kissed and blessed her on leaving the apartment. Slight as the mark of kindness was, it was unexpected, and like the rod of Moses, opened the hidden fountains of waters. Eveline wept a resource which had been that day denied to Hirsch, prayed, and finally sobbed herself to sleep like an infant, with a mind somewhat tranquilized by having given way to this tide of natural emotion. She awoke more than once in the night to recall mingled and gloomy dreams of cells, and of castles, of funerals, and of bridals, of coronets, and of racks and gibbets, but towards morning she fell into sleep more sound than she had hitherto enjoyed, and her visions partook of its soothing character. The lady of the guard, Dolorous, seemed to smile on her amid her dreams, and to promise her Vater's protection. The shade of her father was there also, and with the boldness of a dreamer she saw the paternal resemblance with awe, but without fear. His lips moved, and she heard words their import she did not fully comprehend, save that they spoke of hope, consolation, and approaching happiness. There also glided in, with bright blue eyes fixed upon her, dressed in a tunic of saffron-colored silk, with a mantle of cerulean blue of antique fashion, the form of a female resplendent in that delicate species of beauty which attends the fairest complexion. It was, she thought, the Bretoness Vanda, but her countenance was no longer resentful. Her long yellow hair flew not loose on her shoulders, but was mysteriously braided with oak and mistletoe. Above all, her right hand was gracefully disposed of under her mantle, and it was an unmutilated, unspotted, and beautifully formed hand which crossed the brow of Eveline. Yet under these assurances of favor, a thrill of fear passed over her, as the vision seemed to repeat or chant. Widowed wife and wedded maid, betrothed betrayer and betrayed. All is done that has been said. Vanda's wrong has been wroken. Take her pardon by this token. She bent down as if to kiss Eveline, who started at that instant, and then awoke. Her hand was indeed gently pressed by one as pure and white as her own. The blue eyes and fair hair of a lovely female face with half-filled bosom and disheveled locks flitted through her vision, and indeed its lips approached to those of the lovely sleeper at the moment of her awakening. But it was Rose in whose arms her mistress found herself pressed, and who moistened her face with tears, as in a passion of affection she covered it with kisses. What means this, Rose? Said Eveline. Thank God, you are restored to me, but what mean these bursts of weeping? Let me weep, said Rose. it is long since I have wept for joy, and long I trust it will be ere I again weep for sorrow. News are come on the spur from the guard. Dolorous a Milot has brought them here, is at Libertisso, is his master, and in high favour with Henry here, yet more, but let me not tell it too hastily, you grow pale. No, no, said Eveline, go on, I think I understand you, I think I do. The villain Randall de Lacy, the master mover of all our sorrows, will plague you no more. He was slain by an honest Welshman, and grieved am I that they have hanged the poor man for his good service. Above all, the stout old constable is himself returned from Palestine, as worthy and somewhat wiser than he was, for it is thought he will renounce his contract with your ladyship. Silly girl, said Eveline, crimsoning as high as she had been before. Pale jest, not amidst such a tale, but can this be reality? Is Randall indeed slain? And the constable returned. These were hasty and hurried questions, answered as hastily and confusedly, and broken with ejaculations of surprise, and thanks to heaven and to Our Lady, until the ecstasy of delight sobered down into a sort of tranquil wonder. Meanwhile Damien Lacy also had his explanations to receive, and the mode in which they were conveyed had something remarkable. Damien had for some time been the inhabitant of what our age would have termed a dungeon, but which in the ancient days they called a prison. We are perhaps censurable in making the dwelling, and the food of acknowledged and convicted guilt, more comfortable and palatable than what the parties could have gained by any exertions when at large and supporting themselves by honest labor. But this is a venial error compared to that of our ancestors, who, considering a charge and a conviction as synonymous, treated the accused before sentence in a manner which would have been of itself a severe punishment after he was found guilty. Damien, therefore, notwithstanding his high birth and distinguished rank, was confined, after the manner of the most atrocious criminal, was heavily fettered, fed on the coarsest food, and experienced only this alleviation, that he was permitted to indulge his misery in a solitary and separate cell, the wretched furniture of which was a mean bedstead and a broken table and chair. A coffin and his own arms and initials were painted upon it stood in one corner to remind him of his approaching fate, and a crucifix was placed in another to intimate to him that there was a world beyond, that which must soon close upon him. No noise could penetrate into the iron silence of his prisano, rumor either touching his own fate or that of his friends. Charged with being taken in open arms against the king, he was subject to military law, and to be put to death even without the formality of a hearing, and he foresaw no milder conclusion to his imprisonment. This melancholy dwelling had been the abode of Damien for nearly a month, when, strange as it may seem, his health, which had suffered much from his wounds, began gradually to improve, either benefited by the abstemious diet to which he was reduced, or that certainty, however melancholy, is an evil better endured by many constitutions than the feverish contrast betwixt passion and duty. But the term of his imprisonment seemed drawing speedily to close. His jailer, a sullen Saxon of the lowest order, in more words than he had yet used to him, warned him to look to a speedy change of dwelling, and the tone in which he spoke convinced the prisoner there was no time to be lost. He demanded a confessor, and the jailer, though he withdrew without reply, seemed to intimate by his manner that the boon would be granted. Next morning, at an unusually early hour, the chains and bolts of the cell were heard to clash and groan, and Damien was startled from a broken sleep, which he had not enjoyed for above 2 hours. His eyes were bent on the slowly opening door, as if he had expected the headsman and his assistants. But the jailer ushered in a stout man in a pilgrim's habit. "Is it a priest whom you bring me, warden?" said the unhappy prisoner. "He can best answer the question himself," said the surly official, and presently withdrew. The pilgrim remained standing on the floor with his back to the small window, or rather loophole, by which the cell was imperfectly lighted, and gazed intently upon Damien, who was seated oiled the side of his bed, his pale cheek and disheveled hair bearing a melancholy correspondence. To his heavy irons he returned the pilgrim's gaze, but the imperfect light only showed him that his visitor was a stout old man who wore the scallop shell on his bonnet as a token that he had passed the sea, and carried a palm branch in his hand to show he had visited the Holy Land. "Benedictine, reverend father," said the unhappy young man, "are you a priest, come to unburden my conscience?" "I am not a priest," replied the palmer, but one who brings you news of discomfort. You bring them to one to whom comfort has been long a stranger, and to a place which perchance never knew it, replied Damien. I may be the bolder in my communication, said the palmer. Those in sorrow will better hear ill news than those whom they surprise in the possession of content and happiness. Yet even the situation of the wretched, said Damien, can be rendered more wretched by suspense. I pray you, reverend sir, to speak the worst at Ansif. You come to announce the doom of this poor frame. May God be gracious to the spirit, which must be violently dismissed from it. I have no such charge, said the palmer. I come from the holy Lord, and have the more grief in finding you thus, because my message to you was one addressed to a free man and a wealthy one. For my freedom, said Damien, let these fetters speak, and this apartment for my wealth. But speak out, thy news should my uncle, for I fear thy tale regards him want either my arm or my fortune. This dungeon and my degradation have farther pangs than I had yet supposed, as they render me unable to aid him. Your uncle, young man, said the palmer, is prisoner, I should rather say slave, to the great Soldan, taken in a battle in which he did his duty, though unable to avert the defeat of the Christians, with which it was concluded. He was made prisoner while covering the retreat, but not until he had slain with his own hand for his misfortune, as it has proved Hassan Ali, a favorite of the Soldan. The cruel pagan has caused the worthy knight to be loaded with irons heavier than those you wear, and the dungeon to which he is confined would make this seem a palace. The infidel's first resolution was to put the valiant constable to the most dreadful death which his tormentors could devise, but fame told him that Hugo de Lacy was a man of great power and wealth, and he has demanded a ransom of 10,000 bezants of gold. Your uncle replied that the payment would totally impoverish him and oblige him to dispose of his whole estates. Even then he pleaded time must be allowed him to convert them into money. The Soldan replied that it imported little to him whether a hound like the constable were fat or lean, and that he therefore insisted upon the full amount of the ransom, but he so far relaxed as to make it payable in 3 portions on condition that along with the first portion of the price, the nearest of kin and heir of de Lacy must be placed in his hands as a hostage for what remained due. On these conditions, he consented your uncle should be put at liberty so soon as you arrive in Palestine with the gold. Now may I indeed call myself unhappy, said Damien, that I cannot show my love and duty to my noble uncle, who hath ever been a father to me in my orphan state. It will be a heavy disappointment doubtless to the constable, said the palmer, because he was eager to return to this happy country to fulfill a contract of marriage, which he had formed with a lady of great beauty and fortune. Damien shrunk together in such sort that his fetters clashed, but he made no answer. Were he not your uncle, continued the pilgrim, and well known as a wise man, I should think he is not quite prudent in this matter. Whatever he was before he left England, 2 summers spent in the wars of Palestine, and another, amid the tortures and restraints of a heathen prison, have made him a sorry bridegroom. Peace, pilgrim, said de Lacy with a commanding tone. It is not thy part to censure such a noble knight as my uncle, nor is it meet that I should listen to your strictures. I crave your pardon, young man, said the palmer. I spoke not without some view to your interest, which methinks does not so well consort with thine uncle having an heir of his body. Peace, base man, said Damien. By heaven, I think worse of my cell than I did before, since its doors open to such a counselor, and of my chains, since they restrain me from chastising him. Depart, I pray thee. Not till I have your answer, for your uncle, answered the palmer, my age scorns the anger of thy youth, as the rock despises the foam of the rivulet dashed against it. Then say to my uncle, answered Damien, I am a prisoner, or I would have come to him. I am a confiscated beggar, or I would have sent him my all. Such virtuous purposes are easily and boldly announced, said the palmer, when he who speaks them knows that he cannot be called upon to make good the boast of his tongue. But could I tell thee of thy restoration to freedom and wealth, I trow thou wouldst consider twice ere thy act confirmed the sacrifice thou hast, in thy present state, promised so glibly. Leave me, I prithee, old man, said Damien, thy thought cannot comprehend the tenor of mine. Go, and add not to my distress insults, which I have not the means to avenge. But what if I had it in my power to place thee in the situation of a free and wealthy man? Would it please thee then to be reminded of thy present boast? For, if not, thou mayst rely on my discretion never to mention the difference of sentiment between Damien bound and Damien at liberty. How meanest thou hast thou any meaning save to torment me, said the youth. Not so, replied the old palmer, plucking from his bosom a parchment scroll to which a heavy seal was attached. Know that thy cousin Randall hath been strangely slain, and his treacheries towards the constable, and thee has strangely discovered. The king, in requital of thy sufferings, hath sent thee this full pardon, and endowed thee with a third part of those ample estates which by his death revert to the crown. And hath the king also restored my freedom and my right of blood, exclaimed Damien. From this moment, forthwith, said the palmer, look upon the parchment, hold the royal hand and seal. I must have better proof here, he exclaimed, loudly clashing his irons. At the same time, hear thou, Doggetwooder, son of a Saxon wolfhound. The palmer, striking on the door, seconded the previous exertions for summoning the jailer, who entered accordingly. Warder, said Damien de Lacy in a stern tone, am I yet thy prisoner or no? The sullen jailer consulted the palmer by a look, and then answered to Damien that he was a free man. Then death of thy heart's slave, said Damien impatiently, why hang these fetters on the free limbs of a Norman noble? Each moment they confine him are worth a lifetime of bondage to such a serf as thou. They are soon rid of, Sir Damien, said the man, and I pray you to take some patience when you remember that 10 minutes since you had little right to think these bracelets would have been removed for any other purpose than your progress to the scaffold. Peace, Bandug, said Damien, and be speedy, and thou who hast brought me these good tidings, I forgive thy former bearing. Thou thoughtest doubtless that it was prudent to extort from me professions during my bondage, which might in honor decide my conduct, when at large the suspicion inferred in it was somewhat offensive, but thy motive was to ensure my uncle's liberty. And it is really your purpose, said the palmer, to employ your newly gained freedom in a voyage to Syria, and to exchange your English prison for the dungeon of the Soldan. If thou thyself wilt act as my guide, answered the undaunted youth, you shall not say I dally by the way. And the ransom, said the palmer, how is that to be provided? How but from the estates, which nominally restored to me remain in truth and justice my uncle's, and must be applied to his use. In the first instance, if I mistake not greatly, there is not a Jew or Lombard who would not advance the necessary sums on such security. Therefore, dog, he continued, addressing the jailer, hasten thy unclenching and undoing of rivets, and be not dainty of giving me a little pain, so thou break no limb, for I cannot afford to be stayed on my journey. The palmer looked on a little while, as if surprised at Damien's determination, then exclaimed, I can keep the old man's secret no longer. Such high-souled generosity must not be sacrificed. Hark, the brave Sir Damien, I have a mighty secret still to impart, and as this Saxon churl understands no French, this is no unfit opportunity to communicate it. Know that thine uncle is a changed man in mind, as he is debilitated and broken down in body. Peevishness and jealousy have possessed themselves of a heart which was once strong and generous. His life is now on the dregs, and I grieve to speak it. These dregs are foul and bitter. Is this thy mighty secret, said Damien, that men grow old? I know, and if with infirmity of body comes infirmity of temper, and mind their case, the more strongly claims the dutiful observance of those who are bound to them in blood or affection. I, replied the pilgrim, but the constable's mind has been poisoned against thee by rumors which have reached his ear from England, that there have been thoughts of affection betwixt thee and his betrothed bride Eveline Berenger. How have I touched you now? Not a whit, said Damien, putting on the strongest resolution with which his virtue could supply him. It was but this fellow who struck my shinbone somewhat sharply with his hammer. Proceed, my uncle heard such a report, and believed it. He did, said the palmer, I can well aver it, since he concealed no thought from me, but he prayed me carefully to hide his suspicions from you. Otherwise, said he, the young wolf-cub will never thrust himself into the trap for the deliverance of the old Hulf. Were he once in my prison house, your uncle continued to speak of you, he should rot and die ere I sent 1 penny of ransom to set at liberty the lover of my betrothed bride. Could this be my uncle's sincere purpose? Said Damien, all aghast. Could he plan so much treachery towards me as to leave me in the captivity into which I threw myself for his redemption? Tush, it cannot be. Flatter not yourself with such a vain opinion, said the palmer. If you go to Syria, you go to eternal captivity, while your uncle returns to possession of wealth little diminished and of Eveline Beringer. Ha! Ejaculated Damien, and looking down for an instant demanded of the palmer, in a subdued voice, what he would have him do in such an extremity. The case is plain, according to my poor judgment, replied the palmer. No one is bound to faith with those who mean to observe none with him. Anticipate this treachery of your uncle, and let his now short and infirm existence moulder out in the pestiferous cell to which he would condemn your youthful strength. The royal grant has assigned you lands enough for your honorable support, and wherefore not unite with them? Those of the Garde Dolorouse Eveline Beringer, if I do not greatly mistake, will scarcely say nay. I vouch it on my soul that she will say yes, for I have sure information of her mind. And for her precontract a word from Henry to his holiness now, that they are in the heyday of their reconciliation, will obliterate the name Hugh from the parchment, and insert Damien in its stead. Now by my faith, said Damien arising, and placing his foot upon the stool, that the warder might more easily strike off the last ring by which he was encumbered. I have heard of such things as this. I have heard of beings, who with seeming gravity of word, and aspect with subtle counsels, artfully applied to the frailties of human nature have haunted the cells of despairing men, and made them many a fair promise if they would but exchange for their byways the paths of salvation. Such are the fiend's dearest agents, and in such a guise hath the fiend himself been known to appear in the name of God. Old man, if human thou art, begone. I like not thy words or thy presence. I spit at thy counsels. And mark me, he added with a menacing gesture, look to thine own safety. I shall presently be at liberty. Boy, replied the palmer, folding his arms contemptuously in his cloak, I scorn thy menaces. I leave thee not till we know each other better. I too, said Damien, would fain know whether thou best man or fiend. And now for the trial. As he spoke, the last shackle fell from his leg and clashed on the pavement. And at the same moment he sprung on the palmer, caught him by the waist, and exclaimed, as he made 3 distinct and separate attempts to lift him up and dash him headlong to the earth, this for maligning a noble Manthas, for doubting the honor of a knight, and this with a yet more violent exertion for belying a lady. Each effort of Damien seemed equal to have rooted up a tree, yet though they staggered the old man, they overthrew him not. And while Damien panted with his last exertion, he replied, and take this for so roughly entreating thy father's brother. As he spoke, Damien de Lacy, the best youthful wrestler in Cheshire, received no soft fall on the floor of the dungeon. He arose slowly and astounded, but the palmer had now thrown back both hood and dalmatique, and the features, though bearing marks of age and climate, were those of his uncle, the constable, who calmly observed, I think, Damien, thou art become stronger, or I weaker, since my breast was last pressed against yours in our country's celebrated sport. Thou hadst nigh had me down in that last turn, but that I knew the old de Lacy's backtrip as well as thou. But wherefore kneel, man? He raised him with much kindness, kissed his cheek, and proceeded, think not, my dearest nephew, that I meant in my late disguise to try your faith, which I myself never doubted, but evil tongues had been busy, and it was this which made me resolve on an experiment, the result of which has been as I expected, most honorable for you. And know, for these walls have sometimes ears, even according to the letter. There are ears and eyes not far distant, which have heard and seen the whole. Mary, I wish, though thy last hug had not been so severe a one, my ribs still feel the impression of thy knuckles. Dearest and honored uncle, said Damien. Excuse. There is nothing to excuse, replied his uncle, interrupting him. Have we not wrestled a turn before now? But there remains yet one trial for thee to go through. Get thee out of this hole speedily. Thy best array to accompany me to the church at noon. For Damien, thou must be present at the marriage of the Lady Eveline Beringer. This proposal at once struck to the earth the unhappy young man. For mercy's sake, he exclaimed, hold me excused in this, my gracious uncle. I have been of late severely wounded, and am very weak. As my bones can testify, said his uncle, why man, thou hast the strength of a Norway bear. Passion, answered Damien, might give me strength for a moment, but dearest uncle, ask anything of me rather than this. Methinks, if I have been faulty, some other punishment might suffice. I tell thee, said the constable, thy presence is necessary, indispensably necessary. Strange reports have been abroad which thy absence on this occasion would go far to confirm. Eveline's character and mine own are concerned in this. If so, said Damien, if it be indeed so, no task will be too hard for me, but I trust when the ceremony is over you will not refuse me your consent to take the cross, unless you should prefer my joining the troops destined, as I heard, for the conquest of Ireland. Aye, said the constable, if Evelyn grant you permission, I will not withhold mine. Uncle, said Damien somewhat sternly, you do not know the feelings which you jest with. Nay, said the constable, I compel nothing, for if thou goest to the church, and likest not the match, thou mayst put a stop to it. If thou wilt, the sacrament cannot proceed without the bridegroom's consent. I understand you not, uncle, said Damien, you have already consented. Yes, Damien, he said, I have to withdraw my claim, and to relinquish it in thy favor, for if Eveline Beringer is wedded today, thou art her bridegroom, the church has given her sanction, the king his approbation, lady says not nay, and the question only now remains whether the bridegroom will say yes. The nature of the answer may be easily conceived, nor is it necessary to dwell upon the splendor of the ceremonial which, to atone for his late unmerited severity, Henry honored with his own presence a Melot, and Rose was shortly afterwards united. Old Flammock, having been previously created a gentleman of coat armor, that the gentle Norman blood might without utter derogation mingle with the meaner stream that colored the cheek with crimson and meandered azure over the lovely neck and bosom of the fair Fleming, there was nothing in the manner of the constable towards his nephew and his bride which could infer a regret of the generous self-denial which he had exercised in favor of their youthful passion. But he soon after accepted a high command in the troops destined to invade Ireland, and his name is found amongst the highest in the roll of the chivalrous Normans who first united that fair island to the English crown. Eveline, restored to her own fair castle and domains, failed not to provide for her confessor, as well as for her old soldiers, servants, and retainers. Forgetting their errors, and remembering their fidelity, the confessor was restored to the fleshpots of Egypt, more congenial to his habits than the meager fare of his convent. Even Gillian had the means of subsistence, since to punish her would have been to distress the faithful Raoul. They quarreled for the future part of their lives in plenty, just as they had formerly quarreled in poverty. For wrangling curs will fight over a banquet as fiercely as over a bare bone. Raoul died first, and Gillian, having lost her whetstone, found that, as her youthful looks decayed, her wit turned somewhat blunt. She therefore prudently commenced devotee, and spent hours in long panegyrics on her departed husband. The only serious cause of vexation which I can trace the Lady Eveline having been tried with arose from a visit of her Saxon relative made with much form, but unfortunately at the very time which the Lady Abbess had selected for that same purpose. The discord which arose between these honored personages was of a double character, for they were Norman and Saxon, and moreover differed in opinion concerning the time of holding Easter. This, however, was but a slight gale to disturb the general serenity of Eveline, for, with her unhoped-for union with Damien, ended the trials and sorrows of the betrothed. End of The Betrothed.